Okay, let's go through some of these other movements of the 1960s. Uh, Second wave feminism, the United Farm Workers, civil rights for generally for folks, some Supreme Court decisions, the American Indian movement, and the sort of what's considered the event that launches the gay liberation, what was known then as gay liberation, the LGBT rights movement, which we've come to associate more specifically in our own time with marriage equality, gay marriage, that concept. But let's start at the top with actually the environmental movement. In 1962, you have a book written by a woman named Rachel Carson called Silent Spring, and it's sort of an eye-opener for lots of folks about the use of chemicals, the use of certain chemicals to manipulate the environment, to manipulate crops and whatnot. And not that same year, I don't believe, but near around, forget what year in the 1960s, there's also an oil refinery, an oil spill in Santa Barbara, right? That there's things like that, these sort of catastrophic events where there's sort of firsthand account. Everyone has an eyewitness account. Can see the kind of damage that something like an oil spill causes, right? We just sort of take for granted. We stop at the gas station, put this thing into our gas tank of our car, and drive around, and it doesn't really hit us until you see, like when I was really young, it was the Exxon spill, and you see the little bird with the oil on it and stuff, and it's like, oh, this is really dirty, and it looks like those animals are dying, You also have, later on in the 1960s, a gentleman by the name of Ralph Nader, Lebanese American, who is going to publish Unsafe at Any Speed, which is about the Corvair automobile. This particular book is known as it would be viewed as a consumer rights advocacy thing, not necessarily an environmental thing, because it deals with the safety of a vehicle, not whether or not we should be driving necessarily, but just is this vehicle safe. But Ralph Nader does go on to become the nominee several times of the Green Party. 1992, 96, 2000. He is viewed by many as the spoiler in 2000 for Al Gore because of the vote in Florida being so close, 530 something votes, and Ralph Nader got more than 500 something votes in Florida. Most folks would have voted, of those folks, pretty much all of those folks would have voted for Gore if they had not voted for the Green Party. I could probably say that with a higher degree of certainty than the Ross Perot, divvying up Ross Perot's votes between Bush and Clinton in 1992, which we get into later. But yeah, so Nader, and this is the environmental movement. Carson, Nader, not to be confused with the conservation movement of the sort of progressive era, right? Which had more to, conservation was more, they're not entirely mutually exclusive, right? The conservation movement is about a recognition that if you don't explicitly set aside public lands, eventually they'll all be developed, right? Capitalism, the whole idea of the progressive era was to curb the excesses of capitalism, right? Recognizing that if capitalism is completely unfettered, it could prove to be dangerous in some ways. And so we need to specifically set aside land, this pristine land for everyone to enjoy. But there's no real recognition of, okay, so we've set aside this land, but that doesn't take away from the fact that there's still all this stuff being pumped into the atmosphere. Is this accelerating some sort of change in the environment? Is the elimination of one species or another going to have an effect on the food chain? That's going to affect the environment. Are we making too many cataclysmic and rapid changes in our environment? Stuff like that. I mean, the whole concept of climate change, there's virtual consensus in the scientific community on this one. So I think it's something like if you take all of the published articles out there, and we're talking about scientific studies from private universities, public universities, foreign governments, the United States government, corporations, the IMF, the WTO, all of these different organizations with various motivations. The idea that they're getting various scientists from all over the world at different different points in time, who are doing different types of studies, and all of it's somehow, in an attempt to say, hey, climate change is real, just so that the government can do cap and trade or charge us more for gas. It's just it seems a little far-fetched. The Feminine Mystique, 1963. The Feminine Mystique is written by Betty Friedan, which is known for highlighting what Betty Friedan calls the problem with no name. This problem with no name, Betty Friedan herself and the organization she founds, the National Organization for Women, should really be seen in many respects as this component of second wave feminism for middle class white and upper class white women, right? Because the problem with no name really points to that. The problem with no name being the isolation that women feel in, really in suburban neighborhoods, right? You can think about the women of the progressive era who are living in these tenements, these tightly knit ethnic communities. There's likely not as much isolation because there's not as much space, right? Once you dislocate yourself from those communities into the suburbs, you have more space, you have more comfort, but you're really alone, right? You have probably all these women who are at home all day, kids are at school, husband's at work, and this is the way it's supposed to be. And she's not necessarily of want, but she has no real identity of her own, outside of being, other than how she's attached to these other members of her family. Alcoholism, would be a lot of times women who would drink at home. It's an interesting thing. You could go to like an AA meeting, and some older folks who are there, the men will tell stories of wild carousing and going out and drunk driving stories, and there's a lot of older women who just sort of drank at home, and it wasn't really something where they were getting into legal trouble or making a scene, but it was a problem for them. It was a form of self-medicating. So she's going to launch the National Organization for Women. This is seen as an important component of second wave feminism. It's not on this list. I should probably include it. The following year, in 1964, during the Mississippi Freedom Summer, which is a voter registration drive in Mississippi run by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, there's going to be a sort of a mission statement or a memo called What's the Position of Women in SNCC, right? Which was authored by, I believe, 3 different female members of SNCC, one of which was, I can't remember her name. She's the wife of Tom Hayden, who's also in SNCC. And this is really inappropriate that it's a second wave feminism issue, and I'm only associating her through her husband's name right now. Anyways, Casey Hayden, but I don't know her maiden name, but I think they were already married at the time. What's the position of women in SNCC? Basically, this is an interesting part because it basically, these are younger women, college women. They are, obviously, there are women of color. They're in Mississippi, but there's a lot of white female students from Berkeley and other places, Syracuse, during this voter registration. And they, like the abolitionists, like the white women of the abolitionist movement, where first wave feminism really comes from, they identify their own second-class status with the second-class status of blacks in the South, right? So just as the abolition movement created this sort of awareness in many ways of the mistreatment of, in that instance, mostly northern white women, in this case, women all over the country, various ethnic groups, but many white northern women who go into Mississippi and are wondering, well, why is it that he gets to do the interview and he gets to lead the march and he gets to shake hands with the NAACP, chairman of this city, and I'm just labeling envelopes and getting coffee. Why? And and it goes into all sorts of different levels, of the sort of chauvinism that is still even within a supposedly progressive movement espousing equality, that women still feel that they're treated like objects. There are many instances where women felt. There's some women who admitted later on that felt feeling coerced into sexual relations with white women with black men for fear that if they didn't, they would be considered not quote down with the movement, unquote, or down with equality. Probably a reversal of that too. Probably with white men and black women. I'm not entirely sure on that one. I've gotten into some arguments about that one. Those are definitely some testimonials after the fact, but it is definitely well known that after this paper, it's a position paper. What's the position of women in SNCC? Stokely Carmichael, jokingly, initially as a joke, said the position of women in SNCC is prone, which you can look it up. It's sort of a schoolyard humor, sexual reference. So he's remembered for that and Black Power, the so-called bra burning incident, but rude awakening, reality check. There were no bras burned. First and foremost, for the women who were there, there are many who have stated that the apron really was the symbol that they would have burned if they could have, not the bra, right? The apron, the sort of symbol of the problem with no name. That's sort of confined to the in 17A or to History 1. In the 19th century, it's the cult of domesticity. In the 1700s, it's Republican motherhood. This idea of the public sphere, the political, corporate, public, whatever, religious leaders, corporate leaders, political leaders, people who have leadership roles, people who are out in public, people who address public crowds, who deal, on just stuff like that, are men, and women are in, like the cloisters. They're relegated to this private, household area, and that's their domain that they have some sort of control over or some sort of reign over, but they don't drift beyond that. Similar to, you can look at many societies that have regions of the world that have a more strict interpretation of Islam, where women are covered in public and do not walk alone, walk with multiple women, or stuff like that. Breaking that and viewing the apron as a symbol of that was the most important thing. Having said that, aprons, bras, compacts, high heels, whatever, were not burned. Nothing was burned. There were no bra burners. The bra burning generation, that whole concept, no bras were burned. Why? Because it was in Atlantic City, the Miss America pageant. The Atlantic City has a boardwalk, which is where this protest was. You can't have an open fire on a boardwalk because it'll potentially set the whole thing on fire, right? So there were no bras burned. Some of those tall tales. Yeah, we'll come back to the Miranda versus Arizona. Miranda rights, right? This is a Supreme Court case that states that the police must explicitly tell a suspect if there's a suspect or that are a person of interest and they are detained and or arrested by the police, that they must be informed upfront explicitly of their rights. They're called the Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. I don't know, it's been so long since I've been read them by the police. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed to you. That is total bullshit. I'm sorry, but if you watch Law and Order, you watch these shows, the idea that someone on the street gets arrested and they immediately say, I want a lawyer, and they get a lawyer, that's not how it happens in real life. You actually have to go to court. You have to plea guilty, not guilty, no contest. and only then do you get, if you request one, do you get to go to the public defender's office and talk to somebody, and they'll assign you with a lawyer. And if you have some sort of proof of income, they'll still charge you, which I guess they say if you cannot afford one, but you know, it's not like you get arrested and the cops are saying, well, where did you get the drugs? And you're like, I want a lawyer. I'm done talking to you. I know my rights. It doesn't work like that. You will get arrested. You will go to jail. You will sit there all weekend. They'll bring you out on Monday, and you'll have to deal with a judge in a courtroom on your own before you get legal representation. That's reality. Virginia, Richard and I believe Mildred Loving, Richard and Mildred Loving, from Virginia State, the Commonwealth. They get married. Richard Loving is white. Mildred Loving is black. There are what are called anti-miscegenation laws in Virginia. The term miscegenation comes from the Civil War, the Democratic Party during the Civil War. An accusation, it was a derogatory word, miscegenate, to mix genes in Latin, right? To miscegenate, mix genes, which an accusation, a derogatory term that was thrown at the Republican Party, referred to in the 1860s as the Black Republicans. It was not a term of endearment. The sort of idea that not only they wanted to abolish slavery, give former slaves equal rights to whites, and also encourage procreation that would eventually just blur the color lines, right? Granted, there were some really radical Republicans that probably genuinely believe that, like Thaddeus Stevens, possibly. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that either. If we were all just some sort of brownish shoe, that'd be we could find other reasons to hate each other, like shoe size or something. There are anti-miscegenation laws that are, in some southern states. There are also, I read somewhere that some of these laws, there are 16 states, right? There were 11 states in the Confederacy. There were 4 border slave states. So that's 15 states that had slavery. But there are 16 states in 1967 that had these anti-miscegenation laws on the books. I read somewhere that some of them came about after in the wake of the Immigration Act of 1924, the sort of xenophobic Red Scare pullback that happened after World War I. So I'm not entirely sure on that one. It doesn't seem like they did have laws like this on the books. Not when the Supreme Court case was ruled, though. About a generation, but there were many states. If you look at, there's actually a map where there are 16 states that basically, when this Supreme Court case is decided, they all have to comply. They're the only holdouts. Likewise, actually, when the Supreme Court rules on marriage equality in our own time, gay marriage, the case against Prop 8 and the case against the Defense of Marriage Act in 2012 or 2014, I can't recall, Edith Windsor and whatnot. There are about 36 states where gay marriage was legal, so there's like 14, 15 holdouts. There's states where it's still not allowed, similar number. But if you go back like 10, 20, if you see this map, it's like 10 years prior to this decision or shortly after World War II, the number of states that still have these laws is much greater than 16 and much more spread out than just the South. So in this case, this is an interesting case actually for any constitutional folks out there. The Supreme Court rules on this case. It is argued by the opponents of allowing these two people to marry in Virginia. It is argued the Richard Loving and Mildred Loving and their attorneys argue that they should be allowed to marry under the 14th Amendment, right? Which is the same argument you could make for a gay marriage or various things, right? Equal protection under the law. If certain citizens are allowed to do something, vote, get married, I'm being disqualified for this, arguably arbitrary thing, right? I can't vote because of my skin color. I can't get married because, if you're a citizen and I'm a citizen, why is it that you can get married to that woman and you're a man? I can't get married to this man and I'm a man. You know what I'm saying? So they argue 14th Amendment protection, right? You can't just tell people there's this institution of marriage that involves tax breaks and other things that you can't participate in because you fell in love with a black person or a white person. So the defense of these miscegenation laws, the defense attorney argues that in 1868, when the 14th Amendment passes, it was not the intent of the authors that it would extend this far and apply to marriage, right? It was not their intent. Their intent was specifically to grant citizenship as far as legal protection to serve on juries, stuff like that, to former slaves, and that the concept of cohabitation, marriage between the races, was not the intent of the authors, which is debate. I mean, there were very, very likely some folks in the Republican Party in 1868 who co-authored this bill or sponsored this bill, or definitely voted on the 14th Amendment, who did believe in cohabitation and mixing of the races. However, it doesn't matter because the Supreme Court says in their ruling, Levy v. Virginia, that the intent of the original authors in 1868 of the 14th Amendment, the intent of those folks is irrelevant because, and they actually use this word, the Constitution is an organic document that needs to, 1969, the Stonewall, it's called Stonewall because it was at a stone wall, a great border wall made of stone by Donald Trump. Just kidding. Stonewall is Stonewall Bar. It's in New York. It is what is recognized generally as the first, documented or well-known instance of gay liberation, or what's called gay pride, gay liberation. I need to be more specific. It's at a bar, right? Prior to Stonewall, there were gay bars for lesbians, bars for gay men. There were transgender people of I don't know if they call it transgender yet, but various sexual identities, sexual orientations that would be considered transgressive by the mainstream, by Christian leaders or whoever. And many people were living closeted lifestyles. Most people were living closeted lifestyles because this is really, I mean, if you take history at Gavilan History 1 at Evergreen 17A, and then you take this class, this is the first real instance where we're bringing up the subject of LGBT lifestyle, of the LGBT lifestyle. It's not even on the radar, right? This is the first instance. One of the reasons is because people, generally speaking, lived very closeted lifestyles, not throughout human history necessarily, but in the United States. You go back to the ancient Greek city-states, you go back to the reign of Alexander the Great, and there's some relatively open sexual stuff going on. But in the United States, it's very closeted. There are various reasons for that. One is the American Medical Association listing homosexuality as a mental that basically comes out with an estimate of the percentage of the population that is gay, but also the percentage, not just people. This is how many gay people we think there are. This is how many straight people we think there are. But the idea that most people are in the middle somewhere. That we all are sort of have some sort of percentage of, it's like a scale basically of attraction to the same gender, attraction to the opposite gender. So not everybody necessarily is I'm not saying we're all 50-50. I'm not trying to tell you all what your sexual lifestyle orientation is. I'm going to cut that part out. But for the most part, there's folks remain closeted. Shit. This is fucking awful. What did I do? And they would go to these bars, right? They would go to bars to meet with other folks of their sexual orientation. So sometimes they were married, they had kids, they had their wives, or if they were a gay man, their wife was what they would call a beard, where you have, this is my beard, meaning my mask or my fake identity, right? My fake wife. Sometimes the wives were lesbians and were aware of they were privy to the situation. Sometimes people weren't. You could be a man married to a woman. She needed to get married to display normal, the status quo in American life, and the whole time she's actually not even attracted to you, and she's the mother of multiple children. So you have a situation that could end up being, once revealed, it could be very damaging for all folks involved. Or liberating, but also damaging. And so these bars would get raided by the cops, and the names of people, they would just arrest people, right? They were like laws, they were anti-sodomy laws basically. And so, or for various reasons, they would raid these bars and arrest people. They would publish their name in the paper at times, or they would be, get photographic images of them, and people would lose their jobs. People's spouses, parents would find out about their lifestyle. It was a very damaging, embarrassing. It's a very dehumanizing, belittling experience. That there are some transgender folks at this bar that were definitely some of the original rioters or folks that got aggressive with the police. I'm not sure. But there is definitely a situation in this country where I feel that currently the LGBT movement has become very whitewashed. If you look at the representation of gays and lesbians on television, they're almost all white, mostly men, monogamous relationships, economic, middle upper class, non-threatening. And there is a reality in this country that transgender people of color are one of the groups most susceptible to hate crimes, right? Let's jump back to the last one. The United Farm Workers, there's a picture of some of them. Cesar Chavez is not in this picture, not because I don't like him. He's a wonderful man. But Dolores Huerta is in this picture. And the guy who's looking at us smiling just seems really, really into what's going on. You know what I'm saying? He's just like, huelga. The United Farm Workers, who formed in 1962, but 1965 is the year listed because that is the year of their boycott, their successful grape strike and boycott, right? Boycotting there's farm workers, Filipino, migrants from Latin America, Mexico, probably the children of braceros, former braceros, recent migrants from Latin America, Guatemala, Mexico. Chicano Chicano farm workers, who are Chicano is usually used to describe people of Mexican ancestry who were born in the United States but identify strongly with their Mexican heritage. Don't say Hispanic, especially. I mean, at least not in California. We're not really big on that one. The Hispanic term is not really appreciated by. I say Latino, which is very general. Brazil is technically Latino, right? Because Portugal is a Latin language, but Portuguese is a Latin language. The problem with just saying Mexican is that many people aren't Mexican. There are many people in this country from Nicaragua, El Salvador. There are many people who are half Salvadoran, half Salvadorian, half Mexican. Right? Guatemala. There are many people from Guatemala. The border to get from Guatemala into Mexico is apparently can be even more volatile than the one coming into the United States. But 1965 is the year cited for the successful boycott of grapes and strike against grapes. For farm laborers who were working for various companies. Grapes, and I can't remember, the No Grapes bumper sticker is very iconic. They're led by Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta. Cesar Chavez goes on multiple hunger strikes. The longest, he takes, obviously inspired by Gandhi and King. I don't think, but the hunger strike thing is really a Gandhi, thing that Martin Luther King didn't do necessarily. Martin Luther King got arrested a lot, but Cesar Chavez would go on these hunger strikes, and we're talking like 2 months. I think he went on one for 39 days, and maybe one that went into 40 or 50 days, maybe longer. I'm not sure. But he did one as late as earliest hunger strike he did as a leader of the farm workers was maybe in the 60s and 70s, but he did one as late as the late 1980s, and died in 1993. And he was significantly older. He went on a hunger strike for something like 39 days. And died a few years after that, and I couldn't imagine that not having an effect on a premature death. But to do so for a very marginalized group, marginalized in California for a very long time, not just Latino worker farm hands, but Filipino, East Asian farm hands, that Japanese, Filipino, Portuguese. In many instances, there's Portuguese farm labor in Hawaii and the West Coast.